All right, welcome everyone. Meeting 56, July 5th, 2022. I did post in the Slack channel notification. It looks like recording is going. And welcome to everybody. We do have a code of conduct. Please find that in the meeting agenda, which I will post in the Zoom chats. And check that out if you haven't. If you have any new folks that are interested in introducing themselves, no obligation here, but if you are, feel free to go ahead.
Sure, yeah. Hi, my name is Srikar. I'm an intern on the EKSA team with Micah, Jacob, and Chris. So today I'll be presenting something at this meeting, proposal for Hegel. So I am present today.
Awesome. Welcome, Shrikar. Glad to have you. Anyone else want to introduce themselves or say hi? Hey there. Hi, Brian.
Mike, the mic works now? Yeah. Yeah, I just found out you guys project, so I just want to watch what's going on there. So yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Welcome. Glad to have you on.
Thank you.
Feel free to ask lots of questions.
Okay. I have one thing I keep thinking about it, that translate your manual to Korean. Is that allowed to do it, or do I need permission something?
Good question. I don't know. My gut, this is totally unofficial, but I would say yes. Does anybody see why he couldn't translate it to Korean?
It'd be awesome to have multilingual versions of Tinkerbell docs. Like awesome.
Okay, thank you.
I think well, are we using Hugo? I don't remember what the docs is written in. It doesn't really matter. I mean, I just know most doc sites at this point, like static docs, support multilingual, so it would just be asked to do that. Like I know Kubernetes uses Hugo. That's the other reason, and they do have multilingual support. I know there's just it's configuration effort to support that, but that's not that shouldn't be too huge of a lift. I think honestly the bigger lift is just having folks being willing to contribute and do the translations and keep it up to date.
Yeah, for sure. Is anybody on this call, no obligations here, but is anybody on this call willing to take that action item to check out language translations for our docs? Think about it. If you are, please do speak up in the Slack channel or in here. That would be helpful.
Yeah, I can create an issue for it, just that we do track it. Just investigating what it takes, because having people willing to contribute translations is awesome, but if we don't have the initial setup for it, then it makes it difficult for anybody to contribute to. We're using MakeDocs and MakeDocs translations. Jeremy just linked to something, so hopefully that gets us a head start.
Awesome. Thanks, Marcus. All right, cool. Let's jump into the next section, show and tell. Looks like Chris, you got a couple. Go for it.
I do. Oh, I forgot what I wrote, so forgive me. Yeah, I did we were talking about the release, the Hegel release, or just releasing in general and running the scripts, and people were curious about what that looks like, or at least getting some feedback on what it looked like. And it was super easy. I did the Hegel one to 0.7. It worked as you would imagine. You tag, you run the script, a release pops up in GitHub. It does go in as a pre-release, and then I just edited it and unchecked the box for pre-release and saved manually, and there we go, we had a release. Works well. I would encourage us to do that across the board semi-frequently, given we're on Medge version 0. Just because if code bases are evolving and stuff, it can be useful to keep up to date with that. But yeah, I didn't go ahead and do anything in any other repo. And then the second point, the Rufio obviously is new and whatnot, but we've simplified some of the APIs, naming and whatnot, which is a little bit more concise, aligns a little bit more with Go, and yeah, a little bit more dogmatic. So it's just more of a shout out as we work towards 0.1. I've raised a bunch of issues in Rufio around things that I've noticed that need fixing, things like the contactable condition that tells us that we can actually talk to a BMC, runs once at the beginning and never again. So if something disappears, we wouldn't know, or if secrets change, we wouldn't know, stuff like that. So all those kinds of issues, I think, going towards 0.1 will get patched up in the next couple of weeks, because I'm looking at doing it myself. And then, yeah, hopefully we'll get a release there too. That's it.
Nice. Awesome. Thanks, Chris. Any other show and tell items anybody has? I think Micah posted a link to EKS Anywhere bare metal release announcement from a site that's brought up. Obviously, if you don't know, EKS Anywhere uses Tinkerbell, and there's a lot of buzz around that. I was on a Twitter, what do they call those? The Twitter audio calls. It's called Space. Thank you. I was on a Twitter space with Justin Garrison from Amazon. If you don't know him, he's got a bunch of followers, and they had a really good conversation around EKS Anywhere, but Tinkerbell came up a whole bunch, and I got to chime in a couple times and talk about Tinkerbell, and people were interested and curious. So I think hopefully this momentum somehow influences KubeCon CFP readers, and maybe we get one of these CFPs accepted for the fall, but that would be cool. Yeah, any other show and tell topics folks want to bring up? Okay, let's move on to general topics. Chris, you've got one for Sandbox?
Yeah, there was someone that I was talking to on one of the issues. I think I linked it in there. I keep flicking off this thing. Yeah, so you can click on that. He was just curious about proxy support, and I was just, it occurred to me that it's not necessarily clear what the goal of the Sandbox is. I mean, you can infer it if you know what a Sandbox is, right? But I did wonder two things. One, what's the support like for Sandbox? And two, is its mission to be some deployable thing for hobbyists, or is it more of a production style thing? I would suggest that it's not by the name alone, but that doesn't mean it couldn't be. And yeah, how do we deal with like requests like this coming in? I don't remember who the maintainers of this project are, but I didn't want to leave this person hanging, basically.
Yeah, great questions and topics to bring up. Yeah, I don't think there's a very explicit goal for the repo. I think I'll PR one into the top level README, but if in the GitHub or in the GitHub repo, if you look in the about section, it says the easiest way to set up the Tinkerbell stack.
Oh,
in my opinion, that is the goal. I think it would be better if we stated that very clearly in the README, but that's just me. Me personally, it has gone through some interesting evolution. Some people thought it should be more production-like. Some people thought it should be like a learning ground for how to deploy Tinkerbell. I've pushed back against both of those, and I personally just think it's the quickest and easiest way, maybe not quickest, but the easiest way to stand up Tinkerbell, in my opinion. And I am a maintainer. Myself and Manny are maintainers of that repo, so yeah.
So basically a sandbox.
Yeah, just basically a normal definition of Sandbox.
Yeah, it didn't stray very far there, did we?
Yeah, but I think a great point. I'll PR something into the README just to clarify that very clearly. I just put a definition of sandbox and say, you know, we're using the standard definition.
Yep. And what does that mean for? Because that creates an interesting question around support. Like, if it's just a sandbox, if it's working, then isn't that the job done? Like, sure, you can take feature requests, but how committed are we to worrying about that? I suppose. What you see what I mean? Like, I'm not sure.
Sure. Yeah, personally, my opinion is we've got what, 1, 2, 3, 4 different setups right now. That are known to work. I think supporting those makes sense, and maybe not veering too far out of that. I think we do need to add at least one more for the Kubernetes based Tinkerbell setup, but after that, personally, I wouldn't add any bells and whistles. I don't know. I think maybe some of these issues, like this issue you brought up about proxy, right? I can chime in on it, but I personally, my opinion is we would ask this person to try it out, and if they could get it to work in a proxy, we could put some docs in here. But I don't think extending the support makes a lot of sense, especially with a lot of people's time would need to be to test this and get this up and running. We've had a lot of conversations around this, but I don't know what other folks' opinions or thoughts are.
I think the scope of Sandbox is probably more than a known good setup that also encompasses the onboarding and docs that explain how it works, more so than a code flavored escape room that might work.
Right.
It's almost like an example deployment set of example deployments using certain technologies rather than a. Yeah. Okay. Fair enough. I'll let you answer that specific issue if that's okay, Jacob.
Yep, that sounds good.
If there's no official path and no officially supported path, do we need to say that somewhere? Do we need to say the opposite? So this is the sandbox. Somewhere else, do we need to say? Do we need to either create a repo that says this is the production ready install path, which I don't think any of us are ready to commit to. But if we don't have that, then where would you expect to find the documentation that says we don't have that? We do have Sandbox. If you're looking for commercially supported, production ready Tinkerbell paths, these are, go here. And we link out to like vendor integrations or whatever exists. Like, just, I'm stubbing that out right now based on the future. Is that something that we need to have defined based on what we see? People coming in saying, how do I install this? How am I supposed to do it? And we just send them off to Sandbox. Are we okay with that?
I think we do need it, what you've described, but I think the very first statement you made about being non-committal is also why I'm like, I don't know that we necessarily know what that looks like today. I think that's probably something you have in the back of your mind as we develop this. Like, I mean, I think we raised the question of, do we even want to support the database backend long term? The answer may be yes, but you know, that's a pretty significant architectural thing. And I guess I would be slightly worried that we prematurely publish something. So yeah, back to your original statement, might be a little bit early. I don't know. That's my thoughts.
Yeah, I'll weigh in too. I think there's a few spots that would make sense to add this information in the Sandbox repo itself in the README. I think that's a good spot. I'll add a little more context around this is not considered a production deployment. This is a sandbox, again, learning, etc. I think probably in the Tinkerbell.org docs, that would be helpful too. Anywhere we link out to maybe the Sandbox repo, that might be helpful to say, like, we don't have a production setup yet. We're early repo, early product, and we're still, growing this out or whatever. But That would be my opinion. Yeah, I don't think we have that. Unless, I mean, yeah. Yeah, maybe in the future here, we'll have some actual, I think as part of moving from incubating to what's the next one? Sandbox, I guess. I think we need we need a few customers that are running it somewhere. I think if I have to, I'll have to double check the verbiage. I don't know if they say production, but I think just running it maybe. So maybe as a part of going to Sandbox, we'll actually get some of this info and we could put it somewhere and say, yeah, there's some production setups and we can document them, what they are, et cetera. But yeah, I think at the moment, I'm not, personally, I'm not non-committal. I would say we don't have a production setup, right? So there's nothing to put, in my opinion. But that could change shortly.
Yeah, I mean, I think we can. This isn't like new ground really. We have to break. Like we can just say this is an open source project. Like we don't. The open source project doesn't support. Is not a commercial entity and does not offer production support. Maybe other commercial entities do, but not the open source project.
Yeah. I can add some verbiage around that in my PR into Sandbox, maybe, at least for a jumping off point, we can have it somewhere. Even if it's not in tinkerbell.org, but I'll throw it in my PR into Sandbox. Cool. Any other thoughts or questions or comments around that? All right, let's move on. Shrikar, you want to go?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, let me know if my audio is breaking up. I can turn off my video. In the Tinkerbell community meeting sheet, I linked the pull request that I made just now for my proposal. At a high level, what I'm proposing is a change to Hegel's metadata service. We want to create a new API and expose some new endpoints, and we'll be going over why we want to do this, how we want to do this, and a few of the details here. Does everybody want to take a minute to just like look over the document really quick? It's a one-pager, so it'll take not too long.
Why don't you can go ahead and just summarize probably for this call. Folks, just give us a summary for this call. I think folks can read offline probably, and folks reading the recording or viewing the recording can probably follow along and read it too.
Gotcha. Yeah, sounds good. All right, so starting from the top, we're trying to make a change to Hegel, which is Tinkerbell's metadata service. We want to expose a new API with new endpoints. The reason we want to do this is because currently Hegel exposes Equinix metal instance metadata. This is useful, but it's constraining because we need to be compliant to Equinix's metal instance metadata standard. So what we want to do is open up a new API, and we want to call it Hegel metadata. And this will allow us to open up endpoints as we see fit, iterate on it, evolve this API, and I think it'll be a step in a productive direction, hopefully, for Tinkerbell. So it also, in EKSA specifically has a use case where we want to have disk data exposed. This is useful because we want to make our Tinkerbell templates less static. We want information to be queryable from this metadata service. So configuration can be more dynamic and be automated. So below is a table that details version 0 of the endpoints that we want to be exposing. These include hostname, IP, net mask, gateway, user data, vendor data, disk information, and some SSH data. If anyone has comments on this, feel free to bring this up a little bit later or chime in now if you'd like. But our plan is to make this API iterable and configurable. So we'll be able to add on to it and change it as we see fit, which kind of leads us into versioning. We want to be versioning, or our plan is to version with a single number. And we'll just increment the version number whenever we release a new set of endpoints. And this version number will be part of the endpoint address. So this is going to be a new API we're going to be releasing. We don't want to disrupt the current ecosystem too much. So the default API will be the current existing Equinix focused API. That way, backwards compatibility is maintained. And we're planning to make the API that will be exposed configurable via CLI or environment variable configuration. And only one API will be served at a time, which is that toggleability feature that we're trying to introduce. And there's a few implementation considerations as well that I wanted to bring up, which is we want to refactor a little bit of the code. As it stands, in the code base, the Equinix metadata is actually labeled EC2 metadata. That's inaccurate, and we want to update that to make it less confusing. And there's just some refactoring that we want to do with the HTTP handlers and the filters, so we can introduce this new API and make it toggleable and such. And there's a few questions that we wanted to bring up here at the bottom. Namely, how should IP endpoints be configured? Is interface or a MAC or an interface name the way to do it? Also, just thoughts and opinions on how we should deal with IPv6 and IPv4, and whether anybody has suggestions for additional endpoints. So that's the summary of it. That's the gist. If anybody has any questions or thoughts or wants to discuss anything, feel free to bring something up.
Thought around the endpoints. We've got a single gateway per instance. It might be interesting to move to either like interface or something, because you technically could have multiple gateways depending on your interface.
Gotcha.
So I'm going to chime in because it was me that recommended we didn't do that. Simply on the premise that I couldn't find rationale for having multiple gateways. Maybe this is something is a bit specific that we should maybe talk with comments on the docs. But yeah, I would love to understand if you could throw something, or maybe explain it now. It's up to you, Jacob, why you would have multiple gateways, because I think it's possible, but I don't understand the why.
Yeah, I mean, it's a little tricky to set up too. Source space routing, you have to do some different type things so that traffic comes in and out on the correct interfaces. But I've used it before in the past, where you just have two different networks for different types of things. So these were related to like storage nodes, and so we would have like a traffic or a data network, and we would have a management plane. And typically our storage network, our data plane wasn't routable, and so we didn't need a gateway. But there were times when we did want it routable because we were testing random or one-off or weird types of configurations, and we did want it to go out and be routable to other networks. But in those cases, we had to set up source space routing and we had to do some special things to make sure that multiple default gateways actually worked and made sense. Because you're right, just out the door, out the gate, multiple gateways are not typical and don't generally make sense, but they could, and maybe we don't need it. Maybe it's smart like you did just to do like this is the base case. You get a single gateway, and we won't really do it. I think that makes sense too. Now that I think about it out loud, so I look kind of foolish to say that, but it is what it is. Yeah, that does make a little more sense. And this is just metadata too, right? Like this doesn't determine what a machine does on its own subnets. It can do whatever the heck it wants on its own box, right? This is just an interesting place to gather information about a machine. So yeah, that's fair.
If we're talking about, and we are talking about a new metadata service, a new metadata API within the metadata service, some of it becomes an opportunity to fix some of the problems that we had with the old. One of the problems that we had with the old was that it wasn't really documented anywhere. And I say that, but then I see that in the Tinkerbell docs, we do have a page that breaks out in a table format what every field is and what the description is. One of the things that I would have loved to see in place before was some sort of automated like open API spec of the metadata. So here, what that can mean is just an open API spec definition of V0. And when you talk about generating SDKs, or you said the magic word generating, which gets me to generated SDKs and generated documentation. So one way to express this change instead of in a table would be as an open API spec doc. So I'm just throwing that out there. And then the other thing that I'd throw out there is that the value in having this metadata is that tools like CloudNet, well, one value is that tools like CloudNet can latch onto it. One of the problems that we've had with Tinkerbell and CloudNet is that CloudNet in the Ubuntu project that manages it can, in the past, when it was, I think, Python based, it used to be able to do network calls and figure out what data source was local to it by making API calls. But for optimization, they removed that. And now in the Go version of CloudNet, they use local like DMI data points to find out what the local machine type is. And so for Tinkerbell, it's not like every machine is going to have model name Tinkerbell in there somewhere in available for scanning the machine and finding the word Tinkerbell. Or Hegel or anything like that. So we don't have that advantage, but we do, a user would still be able to say cloud init in their CloudNet enabled operating system on the kernel command line, something like ds equals Hegel or Hegel v0, if this is what we're going to call it. And this should be something that then CloudNet is aware of. Which means that it's worth taking a look at CloudNet and seeing what all the capabilities are to make sure that we're not missing anything here, anything that could be taken advantage of. I see you've got SSH keys and you've got the network addresses. Those are the two main things, and the user data is the main other thing. Vendor data is something that in Tinkerbell is it's a nice to have, but it's also kind of a requirement because there is no vendor neutral way. So having the vendor data is really cool. The disks is obviously something we would take advantage of, hostname. So it looks like you've got everything in here at a glance, but comparing notes with some of the other CloudNet providers, you might find some other fields. On the point of the EC2 compatibility, like the EC2 compatibility is stuff that's inside of version schemed stuff that matches the URL path that Amazon offers. And I get what you're saying in that it's not truly EC2 because it's missing a lot of stuff for the version numbers that are in there, like the 2000, what is it, 2004-0909 or 2009-0404 has some things, but it doesn't have other things. Another approach to improving Hegel's compatibility with existing CloudNet is to just bring in some more of those Amazon versions. So if we had Amazon's like, I don't know, there's a 2012 version, a 2020 version, a 2019, like backfilling all of those to get the same sort of features implemented. And I had one other thought. So while you're talking about V0 and new APIs, we're presumably still rendering URL requests and responses in the same format that we were before, which means that if you access /v0, you're going to get this text listing of all of the subpaths, the gateway, user data. You're going to get those back as like single lines of text followed by carriage returns or breaks, whatever. If that's going to be revisited in any way, or if it's not going to be revisited in any way, I think that's an important part of the spec that's not defined anywhere. It's not really like I was trying to figure out with the AWS spec what it means when there's a slash at the end of a directory name or not. It's not really defined. And in Hegel, or at least in Hegel, it does not include the slash at the end, which is something that I do see on these C2 endpoints. And Cloud Init actually keys off of that. When Cloud Init is like listing a directory, it sees if it ends with a slash, then it knows to recurse into it. So little things like that are also worth highlighting when doing this. A bunch of different points. I wasn't too tangential there.
That point about response structure is really, really good, I think. And I personally hadn't even thought about that. That's something that I don't know that I've read any instance metadata standard or implementation talk about in any degree of detail. So yeah, that's something we could definitely benefit from. Just going back to the EC2 thing, one comment regarding implementing it, we could go ahead and implement that, and there's nothing wrong with that. We could move around to that. That does lose the value of that kind of introduces the same problem space though of we don't have an independently evolvable API if you're going to use EC2 data, which right now is something that EKSA, for example, really had a strong use case for, because you wanted to do the disk information so that we could create more flexible templates and reuse them across instances. So I'm not opposed to that personally. However, I definitely think it's a lower priority than something like this, is how I'd probably phrase it.
If I'm reading correctly, the EC2 metadata does have the ability to do dynamic data categories. And so, I mean, you could potentially follow that standard, still get the cloud init, and still allow you to add, our arbitrary type things without defining our own. Because I think the trade-off of creating our own and not being able to integrate with cloud init's kind of a big one, it feels like. It would be really awesome to just continue to use cloud init. I know there's trade-offs with that in general, but I know, and we're not even probably using any of that at the moment, but that is, I would say, something to consider or think about.
So
feels like you've thought about this already and you've got a nice rebuttal. So
yeah, I was going to let Shrika rebuttal, but he's had to go mute. So Shrika shared with me that he intends to follow up and write a cloud init integration, and possibly as an extension to this, an ignition integration, so that this standard would be usable and become official in the wider ecosystem.
okay. That sounds reasonable. The only concern I have is how long you're going to support that, Shrikar. What's your what are your end of life dates and et cetera?
That's okay. Yeah, that's
mostly a joke. That's mostly a joke.
End of life dates.
Introducing a new standard, sure, I think that seems reasonable, but we do have to then support it. Now that's multiple repos. Now you got to go to cloud init, you got to go to ignition. I think one of the challenges we already have in Tinkerbell is getting people to contribute and come on board, and expanding out what we're integrating with without using existing stuff feels like a stretching us thin. That would be my biggest concern around that. I think it's cool. It'd be a great idea, but yeah, I don't know. Trade-offs.
Yeah, I do want to mention that our goal is to integrate with Cloud Init, or at least develop a plugin to make it compatible. and also possibly Ignition. I know that we use Tinkerbell in EKSA, so we want to make it work with it. So if we do make our own metadata standard, it would hopefully be compatible, at least for now. And yeah, the integrations are a really important part of this Hegel stuff, because it's kind of the whole point of querying instance metadata dynamically. So yeah, I know that Marquez mentioned this. You mentioned this, it's a general concern. So I wanted to address that.
Yeah, that's fair. One last quick thing real quick. I would vote instead of interfaces, use MAC address. I'll just throw that out there. Because interfaces, if I'm not mistaken, can vary per operating system. MAC address will always be the same. I think it might be. And if I'm looking at EC2 metadata, they use MAC address. I feel like they've had metadata for quite a while, and it's probably wise to follow a little bit of their example.
Does every interface, this might be a stupid question, does every kind of interface that you could configure an IP on have a MAC address? I didn't think it did, but
that I'm aware of. Do you have an example of an interface that doesn't?
I'm thinking virtual interfaces. Could a virtual interface exist without a MAC address?
Not that I'm aware of. Anybody else know? Pretty sure that's a hard requirement for networking.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, great. Thanks so much, everybody. We appreciate your comments. I took some notes on the side while everybody was speaking, but I'll probably go back and rewatch this recording just to make sure I got everything. And I'll be in contact with you guys. Probably come to the next Tinkerbell meeting to give you guys some updates. Chris is my mentor for my internship, so him and I are talking every day. And yeah, if anything needs to be communicated to you guys before that, I'll go through him.
Cool. Thanks, Shrikar. Any other final comments or questions or thoughts?
That's it from me. Thanks, guys.
Next steps. We obviously want to get to a decision. There sounded like there was some reservation around, or not so much reservations, actually just sound like an ask to explore the EC2 dynamic data and just validate that that isn't an option that we could favor instead of developing our own standard, because there is that trade-off of additional maintenance. So if we do that, is that kind of a segue into getting a decision on committing to an API like this? Obviously, we need to update it, but how do we usually go about making a decision? Is there even a process? I don't know if we have one yet.
Yeah, you're the maintainer. You're the maintainer of Hegel, and I think you and Shrikar are already doing the process. I think is what you're doing right now is what should be done. We do have the proposals repo, and this is kind of a bigger change. You might, I don't know if it's kind of and the process is what it is. So I would recommend following that. Maybe throw in a proposal into that repo, just because this is a significant possible change, right? It could be an addition instead of a change, but yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, as the maintainer of Hegel, I feel like you and the other maintainers kind of have the responsibility to lead the direction here. So a lot of it could be new ground. So figure out what works best, right? And just run with it, to be my opinion. I don't know if anybody else had thoughts on that.
I'm open to like a V0 in terms of like, this is like a proof of concept. Let's see it out. And I've questioned that myself with the cloud init, like whether Hegel should be considered its own format, or if because it is that, right? When you're talking about what that Equinix metal layer is, that is its own layer. And I wanted to bring that up to cloud init as a PR, that it would introduce it as the Equinix metal data source. But I could have just as well called the Tinkerbell data source because of the overlap that's there today. And so I was exploring that in the PR where I did bring that up in the past. If we were to introduce a new V0, it's new ground, but like you're saying, is it something that we want to continue supporting forever? And what real benefits do we get over that EC2 compatibility layer? So it's all just thoughts, no answers.
Let's let's take an action, Shrika, to go ahead and look at EC2 a little bit more seriously, and then maybe document some trade-offs, pros and cons kind of thing, and then circulate that, and then we can look with the other maintainers to make a final decision.
For sure. I'll note that down.
Right on. Thanks, Shrikar. Appreciate that. All right, moving on. Next topic. I threw one out there. We have a Tink server regression. There's a PR 632. I'll post it here in the Zoom chats. I just wanted to see if any folks could get some eyes on it. It is kind of it is only I've only tested it against the, I don't know what we're calling it, the Postgres backend. I don't know if it happens. Oh no, it should happen in all, because this endpoint is the reporting endpoint, which is all cases. I don't know why we're not seeing it more often, at least from the EKS Anywhere side, but this is a regression that has problems with running the last action in any workflow that I'm aware of.
It looks like your fix is in the server package on the DB server specifically, so I don't think that will. It's a different implementation for Kubernetes.
Does that? It's not inside of. Oh, you're right. It is inside of that specific.
So it might be parallel code in Kubernetes that could be the Kubernetes server that could be affected, but it'd be a different implementation.
Got it. That's why we're not seeing it. Okay, sure. That seems, that makes sense. It is blocked. It is failing in the Sandbox, FYI. So if folks have a chance, I'd just appreciate some eyes on that. Cool. That's all I had, and that is our last topic. Any other ad hoc topics or discussions anyone wants to bring up?
I have an ad hoc thing around actions now that you're talking about them and them not completing. I feel like we need to define a rule. All actions must complete. And I know we've thought about trying to patch it in a few different ways. Jacob, you and I brainstormed, particularly kexec and reboot. But there needs to, I feel like we need to figure out a pathway where all actions do ultimately end in them going error or complete, some end state, and stop relying on timeout and that kind of pretending to be complete, because I feel like it creates, I mean, it's just not great. We know that.
I mean, how do you support that with kexec though?
We had some ideas. I think one was fire off the request right before you invoke kexec, fire off the post right before you invoke kexec. Which has its own trade-offs, but at the same time, yeah, I'd rather that than have to sit there for an hour or whatever it is, waiting to see it time out.
Right.
Or make it customizable.
Yeah, this one's tricky, right? Because you want to, I mean, actions in and of themselves are opaque to Tinkerbell in general, right? This is an implementation detail. Theoretically, you could write an action to do whatever you wanted. And so how do you enforce this idea around it, right? I mean, we have a spec, right? We have this kind of idea around an API spec around the definition in your template of an action, but enforcing what an action, the implementation does in the action, that seems like I don't know, how do you do that without squashing the idea that, well, an action could be anything you want, right? Because there's other things, yeah, right. And there's other things we talked about, I think maybe you and I, Chris, but also I think we've talked about in general in the community where we could extend the spec to handle have flags or something that define an action that might not complete or something like that, right? Or that you want to be background, or that you want to say, mark as complete. I'm not describing these very well, but you could say like, hey, this action, ignore its exit status and just always mark it complete or something like that. Or you could have one that's always marked as failed. I mean, those are additional ideas that would allow us to create this kind of, what's the right word, right? The constraints, but not hinder what someone would do inside of an action, right?
Right.
I don't know.
It's a difficult thing, right? Like, yeah, you want to have clear boundaries, clear delineations between responsibilities, right? But yeah, I can't help but feel that having no way of, like, the only option is to just time out is bad. So yeah, maybe some sort of API change that allows you to say that this action is async or something. And the complete means it launched, not it completed per se.
Right. Yeah, that's
And then
another interesting idea is trigger off the start of the action instead of the completion. If there's a flag that could toggle that, that's pretty generic. And then you could add that to things like kexec and reboot and just say, hey, once I see that this has started, and we do that actually in cluster API Tinkerbell, right? We actually have some logic in there, if I'm not mistaken, right, Chris, to just check if something has been started, like a final action has been started, and do some other interesting triggers off of that. I think I've seen personally in the community a lot of people talking about actions like kexec and reboot where they don't complete, and so you do also get a workflow that has a failure when it's not actually a failure. So this idea could solve some of those challenges too.
Yeah. Maybe I'll write something up if I have some time here soon and throw that in the proposals.
I feel like just maybe a little more fuel for what you're going to write up to. There has been thoughts around backgrounding actions, and I think that would need some serious contemplation because that opens up some interesting ideas too, right? Excuse me, because if you background an action and then you move on immediately, you could theoretically start to enable things like customized logging, right? If I had my very first action was my own custom logger that sent data to wherever I wanted, read container logs and it could send it out, excuse me, then you could run that in the start and you could start sending logs out to where you want, right? So it could enable some interesting other use cases that have been brought up in the past. And then I think if I understand some of the things Manny has brought up in the past too, he's thought about standing up entire stacks of like Hegel metadata servers. So you could have an action theoretically that stood up a metadata server. If it was background, then all your other actions could just call that and get its own metadata. I'm not fully fleshing out the idea here, but that was some of the general thoughts that I know Manny had in the past. But yeah. Anyway, just some other things that probably weren't helpful for you to think about. So sorry. Any other thoughts, opinions, questions around this?
I thought that we had issues open around async stuff, and I looked and what I found was event-driven Tinkerbell, which I don't think is this. Link it in the Zoom just in case it touched on anything that was tangential, but not so sure.
Yeah, this one's I feel like there could be some underlying connection, but yeah, I think they're probably distinct for me. And not only that, but the context of this proposal, this was actually implemented and then pulled back out because it ended up being too complicated, and amongst other reasons. So. All right, just a couple more minutes here. Any other topics anybody wants to bring up, or questions in general, thoughts? Going once, going twice. All right. Thanks y'all for attending. We'll close it out this same time next week. We'll be at Tinkerbell triage meetings. Please check that out. No experience required, but thanks for participating, and see y'all online. Take care.